Hello everyone, and welcome to office hours for the last week in January. For these end of the month sessions, we pick a specific topic and get our panel to do some show and tell, as well as answering your questions. So this time, we're going to talk about Salesforce automation tools, specifically workflow rules and process builder. And I'm really grateful to Kim, to Nick, and to TJ for volunteering their time to be your guides to this topic for the next hour. So I just wanted to give you a quick idea of our agenda for this session. We're going to split it roughly into thirds. First of all, we're going to give you some ideas about choosing the right automation tool for the job at hand, because each of these tools has slightly different features. And then we're going to look at time triggers. That is, if you want to apply some kind of schedule to the actions that are taken by the rule or process. And then we're going to look at an example of a more complicated process to give you some ideas and inspiration. But if you have questions as we're talking, feel free to post them in chat, and we'll pause to answer the questions as we receive them or as they fit into the conversation. Since there are an awful lot of you on this call, which is great, welcome everybody, I'd be grateful if you could mute your mic throughout the session, unless you are actually the presenter, of course, or unless we ask you to speak and give us some more details. So thanks for that. But otherwise, I think that's all I need to say by way of introduction. So let's get started. Kim, you'd offered to provide us some thoughts about choosing the right automation tool for the job. So over to you, and there you go. You are now the presenter. Thanks, Kim. Take it away.
Yeah, can you see my screen okay?
Yeah, I can see it just fine.
All right, we'll try to start the slideshow. So yeah, thanks for joining everyone today. We'll talk about Salesforce automation tools, and there are quite a few of them available to you, but sometimes people wonder, what should I use and when should I use it? So my theory is to keep it as simple as possible and work your way up the chain if you need to. So today I'll tell a little bit about workflow rules, and then process builder, a tiny bit about workflow, visual workflow, and then the final step is code. We won't really talk about that today, but that would be the last step in the automation tool train if you needed to use that. So first, workflow rules. In a workflow rule, you can do things like update a field or send off an email alert. You could create a task for an internal user, and you can send an outbound message. Generally, those would be a message to another external system, some integration you may have involved. That's what those would be. What's great about them is that you can set up your workflow rule to run as soon as something happens, or as soon as something happens, I want you to do this 3 weeks later. If that's still the case, you can add a time criteria to that, and Nick will talk a lot about that in a little bit. I know this might be confusing, but it does not affect your SOCL limits. So Salesforce applies a lot of governor limits to things you can do in the system, and a workflow rule will not affect that limit for you. So that can be a good thing if you have a lot of workflow rules in place. And the last thing I really like about it is if you're using time-based workflow, you can go to the time-based queue and you can see each one of the things in the line of when it's going to go. And sometimes that's really useful to see, hey, I did this action and I don't know if this thing is scheduled to run next week or 2 months from now or whatever. You can go out there and see. So workflow rules are the simplest of what is available to you. And there's a lot you can do with a workflow rule. But if you're using workflow rules, one thing you cannot do is you cannot control the order of execution. So if you want to update a field and then do this other thing, like create a task for somebody based on 2 different workflow rules, 2 different ideal criteria, you're not able to control which one fires when. So sometimes you run into that limit. And the other thing is it doesn't really run on bulk per se. It only runs after an action happens, and on a particular record, it will trigger that rule to run. So if you wanted to run this on a whole bunch of records, you would have to trigger something on each one of those records. An example of that would be, let's say you get a new donation, you check it off as received, and you want to send off an email thank you to the donor, and then you also want to update a field on your donation, maybe it's called acknowledged or something like that. It's a pretty simple and useful case for a workflow rule. So when that maybe doesn't get the job done for you, there's something else you want to do, or you do need to control your order of execution, you can move to Process Builder. Process Builder can basically do everything that you can do in workflow except for an outbound message, but you can do a whole lot more. So you can update the record that fired your trigger that did the action, or you can update a bunch of records that are related to it. You can create records, which you cannot do in workflow. You can run Apex. You can tell it to run a visual workflow. You can post something to Chatter. You can kick off a different process. Lots of things you can do. You can also auto-submit something for approval. So there's a lot more opened up in your world there. You can also run things immediately or on a time-based schedule, and here you can control the order of execution. So if you want to make sure I update this field and then I schedule this email to be sent or this other record to be created or whatever that is, you can control how that happens. But it will affect your limits. So if you have a bunch running and you're running things in bulk, you may hit those limits. Again, it only runs on the record that triggered it unless you have it also triggering off a flow, which I'll talk about in a second.
But it's interesting, isn't it, that you can both update and create records which aren't the original record. I think that's one of the other good things about Process Builder, isn't it?
That's true. Yeah, I love that. I love Process Builder.
Yeah. And the one that I really like, which I think is useful on the updates, is that it's useful, isn't it? Because you can do things like you can update a campaign or something, which is like which you're not able to do with workflow, aren't you? There's a limit to which fields you can update. So.
Right, exactly. And if you're using a time-based thing, the other limit that sometimes I struggle with is when a Process Builder has a time-based element or multiple time-based elements and it's triggered and it's running and now it's in the wait process, you don't get to see those in the time-based workflow queue. You can go to the flows section and look at your paused flows. It doesn't give you as much information. So if you have 3 time-based things sort of in line for that one process, for that one record, you're just going to see that process is in wait, but you can't exactly see which step it is. So sometimes that's limiting if you have a lot going on in that process and you're trying to figure out what's really going to happen next. It's hard to see that. An example would be, a simple example is somebody on the account is a member and the membership level changes and you want to sort of trickle that membership level down to all of the contact records. You can do that with the Process Builder. So you can, that account change happens, it triggers the process, and it goes and updates all of the children's contacts for that particular record. And then if that maybe doesn't always get the job done, you can go to Visual Workflow, and I preface that by auto launch. So I sort of set this up as things that you might trigger through a Process Builder, a Visual Workflow that might trigger through there. So in that case, it's auto launched and it would not need any additional user input. But here you can do pretty much anything. You can look up records, update records, create records. You can also delete records, which is something you can't do in the other 2 sections. You can go through a loop. So if you pull back a number of opportunities related to this account, you can loop through them and maybe do a calculation or figure something out. You can include decisions. So I want to pull back all of these opportunities, and if they were from this year, go down this tree and do these things, but if they're from older times, do something completely different. You can assign values. You can run records in bulk this way. They can be something that happens immediately, or you can add wait elements to sort of replicate that time-based thing. They do affect your limit. In an auto-launched flow, you don't want any screen elements that would require additional user input, and they also can only see those in the paused flow section. So here I have one as an example. When a donation is received, you want to go and check, is this person a part of the campaign that donation came from? And if they are, update their status, or if they're not, go ahead and add that primary donor to that campaign. That's something you could do with a flow. You could kind of do that in Process Builder too, but that's a flow that we have written a number of times. And then lastly, if none of that works for you, you might have to look at some code. You can pretty much do all of the same things as well there on code. but they can be something that can be scheduled, which is nice, and you can run them in bulk. And the other two things you can do that's great is you can run that before a record is saved, or when a record is deleted, you could trigger something. But you do have to know Apex, which a lot of people don't. So there's a learning curve there. So an example of that is a donation gets deleted, you might want to recalculate the total giving on the account, or at the beginning of every year, you want to recalculate all of that yearly giving. So what happened this year changes to last year, and et cetera. And basically that is it. But I just wanted to go through sort of the steps. Any questions?
Well, there is a question waiting, and I also wanted to say that, I mean, it's interesting, isn't it, that kind of, as you've been going through, these things get more complex each time, and you need a bit more knowledge. And I also, we will kind of touch on visual workflow today, but we are going to do a whole office hours that is about visual workflow a bit later in the year, in March, because it takes a bit of getting used to, doesn't it, Kim? I think that because there are a lot more options, it's a whole different thing. So there are a couple of questions that have come in. One of them, I think this is quite an interesting topic to dig into. So maybe actually we'll do the quick one first. There's a question from Christy about what is this SOCL limit that we should be paying attention to, and how do you check that? So if anyone on the panel would like to help with that, and then we'll talk about the difference between these rules and formulas, which I think is an interesting question that's just above it. So
sure,
actually, yeah, go ahead, Kim.
The SOCL limit, SOCL is like object query language something, and I don't really what it stands for, but every time you're running a query on the data, and so you're running something like you're needing to update a record or pull in this record or something like that, and you can look on the Salesforce help lines, they'll be more descriptive than I am. Each one maybe counts for 1 or 2 or something, and you only get like 150 in a certain run. So if you have a lot going on in your process, you could hit that, and then your process won't complete, or you'll start to get errors. The best way to check that is to run a debug log on a user and have the user do the action you want, and you can sort of watch the process run in the debug log, and then it'll tell you how many SOCL queries you've used.
What sort of processes do you think if you're worried about the limits, or perhaps when would you need to worry about the limits? What sort of processes might take you over that limit?
I think something with a lot of record creation, a lot of updating, something that's actually performing an action is where you're going to probably end up with the most. But the help text gives you a good idea to help you kind of count through how many you might get. It's probably rare that you'll hit them, but just know that you could.
That's great advice, thank you. So there was a question that came just above it. Sorry, it still says waiting for name, so I'm not sure who asked it. Which says formula can also update fields. So how do I decide when to use a formula instead of or in coordination with workflow and process builder? Kim, do you want to talk to that, or anyone else on the panel? What's your about that?
A formula will calculate your answer, but it will not technically update your record, and therefore you couldn't perform another action. So if something happens, when something happens, you want something else to happen, a formula will not trigger that. And that's really the key. So if you need that answer, that the result of that formula to make the system do something else, then you probably don't want a formula, and you'd rather have a field update.
And another reason to have a regular field, whether it's text, pick list, other instead of a formula, is if that field ever needs to be manually edited. Or for instance, let's say you want to calculate the fair market value, and you have many gifts you have 4 or 5 gifts every month. And you don't want to keep track of, over the years, every single gift that you have ever given over, let's say, 5 or 10 years. That formula field would have to remember that if it was a formula field, because as soon as you remove that gift from that formula field, you lose that data. So if you only want to really keep track of, have to update or have the field or workflow keep track of just the ones that are active, you would have that be an update of some sort. Because you can run out of characters in a formula field. So if you're doing something that you're always having to add to, you can run out of characters in a formula field, which you wouldn't want to do. But also you may want to manually override that. Like, say you have a level, like this person's at premier level, but your fundraisers might say, you know what, we're going to bump them up or we're going to bump them down based on their activity. So that's the case where, in most cases, formulas would work, but you may occasionally want to manually edit that, and in that case, you would also not want that to be a formula field.
I think that's a really great example. Yeah, and the other thing you have to be careful with formula fields is you can't then use them in roll-up summaries, can you? It's kind of, that's often that's often one of the tricks where I find myself writing a workflow rule, is because I want to be able to use that field for some other purpose. And yeah.
I always forget that one, Caroline, and I create it and then I go, wait, why isn't that showing up?
Yeah, exactly. And yes, one day maybe we'll be able to use formula fields in roll-up summaries, but until then. But thanks for that example, TJ. That's great. And thank you for the slides, Kim. And if anyone wants to go back to Kim's slides, we can certainly swap presenter back. But I am recording this session, so you'll be able to get hold of it later. So I assume the same Waiting for Name, thank you Waiting for Name, asked a follow-up question, which is also an interesting one. How do workflow rules, process builder, visual workflow affect decisions about the data model? i.e. when a new object is a better choice than adding additional fields? That's an interesting one. Oh, and you've really got everybody thinking. Okay, come on.
You know, one of the considerations that I think about, you know, not necessarily about, you know, when to build an object or a field, specifically about, you know, how to relate different objects together, would be in some cases with lookup as related lookups and master detail relationships. In some cases with items like a workflow rule, if it's a lookup relationship and I'm trying to update, say, a value on the parent record or on the child record, I can't remember which way it flows right now, but there's one way that I won't be able to in a lookup relationship. In a master detail, you're able to do some updates where, say, a child record was updated, go update the parent, or vice versa. So that's one thing to consider. Process Builder allows for some more abilities there. I don't know if anyone else has anything else to chime in on.
As far as data model with Process Builder versus other objects, I don't think you should take into account the automation when considering other objects, because the automations exist. You can do it whether it's in the same object with a custom field or a separate object. You just might change whether it's Process Builder or Process Builder with Flow. When you're considering field versus object, you really have to consider the org's overall goals and mainly their reporting needs and data entry. So once you figure out what the org's needs are and say, you know what, this is a whole separate set, like we have this volunteer event and we want to track something completely different with its own sets of values that aren't really specific to that one event, then you might want to say, okay, like let's do a custom object, but you know, reporting ease. Do you want to jump multiple objects in your reporting? When you're having your folks do data entry, do you want to have them have to do that in multiple places? And then once you define that data structure, then you figure out the automation behind it. Try not to have the automation define your your data strategy. It's the other way around.
That's great, thank you. As you see, Stuart, I did see your question about the task that runs in 30 days, and I've kind of punted that to Nick because I'm hoping that he'll mention it when he gets to talk about timing of things in a few minutes. One question a question here from Josh. Have you successfully used form assembly in conjunction with Process Builder or Visual Workflow, and are there any issues to be aware of? Josh, is that you're bringing some information into Salesforce and then you want to add some automation in some way after the information's captured?
Yes, that's right.
I actually have.
You shouldn't have a problem with that. I've done that before. Maybe not so much. It depends. Visual workflow without screens you could do. It shouldn't really matter. You could trigger those once the data from form assembly comes in. If you're updating a number of objects through form assembly and you need that process builder to sort of wait till that's done, you might want to add a wait element on there. So let it ride for 5 minutes or something and then let it go so that all the data is there. But it is possible to do that.
Yeah, and I've used form assembly a lot with Process Builder and flows. However, I found that sometimes just building it in form assembly is so much more streamlined. If it's the form assembly data, that's the only thing that would be affected by those process builders and flows, because form assembly can do all of that on its own. But I've had no problems with it triggering process builder flows, workflow rules, any of that. We have it working in conjunction, and they're working just fine.
Yeah, kind of piggybacking on what everyone else has been saying, I think if I've ran into an issue before with form assembly and process builder, it's likely been due to an issue I had on the process builder side, not because I had form assembly involved. It was because the process builder was causing an error, not necessarily because form assembly was there. It was the process builder that was causing the issue.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, and I think I've come across the same thing that Kim was just mentioning, which is that that there's a kind of a delay in all the information being available, which is has thrown out a process. So yeah, you're right, Kim, about that idea that sometimes you may need to wait. But yeah, form assembly can do so much, can't it? It's great. Okay, let's. Okay, thanks for the question. So let's move on. We were going to talk a little bit about time triggers and time-based workflow. Over to you, Nick. Would you like me to make you the presenter, or are you just talking?
Yeah, that'd be great. Yeah, if you can make me a presenter, that'd be great.
Okay.
Oh, for some reason, I need to download the extension, so I'll quick do that.
Okay.
I think now can you see my screen?
We can.
Perfect. That's maybe the quickest download I've ever had in my life. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about time-based workflows. And so as Kim was mentioning, there's a plethora of options out there. And one of the really nifty things with workflows and process builders and all these for that matter, there's kind of different times that we can tell when one of these actions occur. And so, some of you may be familiar with the immediate action. So here's just a simple rule that I have set up when a donation is created or edited, and there's a couple actions that are happening here. And you'll notice there's immediate actions, and it'll do those, and then there's a time-based workflow actions. And in this case, it doesn't work, or it says you can't add, because your evaluation criteria is every time a record is created. And the one thing I just want to call out why time-based rules are really cool is that say an hour from now, 2 days from now, 30 days from now, I want an action to occur. I can do that with these workflows. However, there's some kind of ways that I need to make this work in order to do that. And the first thing I want to showcase here is that in order to allow for a workflow rule to be a time-based workflow, I need to make sure that it's either only when it was created or when it was created and anytime it was edited to subsequently meet the criteria. And why we need to do this is kind of getting a little bit at Stuart's question in that we need to, every time effectively I'm saving this record, Salesforce is going back in and re-evaluating each one of these workflow rules for that matter. And so it's going in and going, hey, does it still meet this criteria? Or if it didn't meet the criteria before, does it now? And so that's where it's better to have it say, and anytime it's edited to subsequently meet the criteria. So I'd say it didn't meet before. So maybe I'm wanting to have stage as posted or closed one, and I had a pledge in there. The second that I change that to posted or closed one, I could have a time-based workflow that gets put into the queue. Vice versa, if maybe I have acknowledgement that's set up on a record and I wanted to send a task 5 days after a workflow, after a donation is made, and say that a box on the opportunity record is not checked. Say I go in and 4 days after, I say, hey, I checked the box saying I sent out that acknowledgement, and by doing that, it'll take out the record out of the queue, so it wouldn't fire on that 5th day. So that gets at a little bit of Stuart's question there. What I want to showcase today is actually a rule that I learned from a blog recently, and I can post it in the notes here afterwards. The main thing the cool thing with time-based workflows is that I can tell it to either, let's see here. Let's just quick go and add one right here to our record. And the two options when I add a time trader, I can do X number of hours or X number of days before or after, and then you'll notice there's a handful of fields here. And so I'm kind of telling, okay, based on this criteria, so based on close date, based on when it was created, things along those lines are when I can tell it when to fire and how soon to fire before or after. So that which is great when you're doing days, and even sometimes you want it 4 hours after. The issue that sometimes people run into is sometimes they want to have a rule run, say 15 minutes after a record is created, or not a defined amount of hours, but maybe in minutes and things along those lines. And so that's where there's a nifty little trick that I've learned that we can work around that. And so in order to kind of show that, actually here's the blog right here that I'll post. In order to show how this all works, on the opportunity record, I went and created a field, and the formula, it's a formula field, and the logic to this field is I'm basing it, you kind of tell it how you want to base it based on the whatever date field you wanting to have. And specifically it'll work for date time fields. And so I'm doing create date minus, and there's this random number here that's 0.0380, and effectively what this is doing is it's converting that date and time, and it's doing some math in the background to say, hey, I wanted to send 5 minutes before this workflow rule, or 15 minutes before this, things along those lines. This little nifty chart here has become kind of a go-to chart for me to figure this out in terms of what do I put in that value. And so there's a formula value here that I'll put in, and that would relate to how many minutes ago, effectively that formula field will say, hey, it was X number of minutes ago. And by kind of it's almost like you're outsmarting a system by saying, hey, I wanted this to be 55 minutes ago. Therefore, Salesforce will think that if I fired it off an hour from now, which is 55 minutes ago, it will fire in 5 minutes from now. It's kind of, that may or may not make complete sense, but we'll show it here in a second on a record that we have over here. So here is just a donation record that we created today, and you'll notice that the create date was, just right before we started this meeting. And what I have right below is that formula field that I created. You'll notice that it is 55 minutes before the create date. And that's an interesting thing, because what we can do is when we're on the trigger side here, we can say that we want it to trigger 1 hour after this, this 5-minute, this field that I just created. And so when I fire, when I click save here, or I'm actually just going to clone this record, and we can kind of see this in action here. So I'll just click save, or clone this record, and this is a brand new record. And so in 5 minutes, we will have a new activity that will show up in the open activities. They'll say, thank donor. And all I did was I added this time-based rule right here to the rule, and then I added the task to that as well. And so that's kind of this nifty little trick to make time-based workflows be on a non-hour basis. And we can come back in a couple minutes. This will be kind of like we're cooking. We'll come back in 5 minutes and watch this thing bake, and we can see this record show up here.
Oh yes, absolutely. Well, that gives you 5 minutes to answer another question. That's great. That's a nice trick. So actually, yes, and Josh says, please would you post the link for the blog in the blog post. Stuart had a follow-up question, and this time in Process Builder rather than Workflow, but can you set a time-based action that triggers another Process Builder at that time, and it will evaluate against the same original record?
Let me quick check here. Let's see here. Is this, I have a Process Builder up. Hope me I'm on the run. So we can add an action. Let's see if we can trigger. Yeah, we can trigger another process from that scheduled action. And so I don't know if I may not have an example here that will allow for that, for us to do this, but you can trigger processes through this.
Would it trigger, my question is, I don't know the answer to, would it trigger on the same, it would trigger on the same record, but maybe not the original record? I don't think, because what if that record changed within an hour?
Let's think about that. Well, I think it goes back to the rule criteria. If it still meets the rule, it would fire. If it didn't and it subsequently did meet, then it may or may not, because the first rule didn't fire.
Right.
So would you need to then check to make sure that that the process would reevaluate the records? There's that checkbox, isn't there, on
Is it?
Yeah, you might need to.
I always forget which page it's on here. It's this one. This advanced. That section right there. And this is what we've been talking about. In order for the this time-based workflow to work, we need to make sure that this box is also checked.
And there is also, I've never explored it, but there is an option when you first create a process, isn't there, that you can have a process based on something else. I think, isn't there a...
yeah, it's either record changes or off of another process.
Yeah, so that might be an option as well, Stuart, to think about. And you can also put other steps in the process, can't you? But that's usually more helpful for if your criteria have changed.
You can also do the evaluate the next node or next criteria, but you can't do it if you have scheduled actions.
Oh, that's true. Of course, that has to be immediate actions. Yeah, that's it. Interesting. You keep coming up with all that. There's always something, isn't there, that sort of takes some experimenting with this tool. Yeah.
Depending on how complex your needs are with the wait, reevaluate, you might want to move into a flow, because within the flows, in a single flow, you can have a wait. and then have it move on to that next step. And that next step, you might want to reevaluate, is this still a valid thing to move forward with? And if something has changed in that time frame, then it can say, okay, I'm not going to do this. But if it hasn't, then proceed with the next steps. So it depends on, is there a chance that it might change? If so, you might want to get a little more complex with it. If it's not, and just always do it at the same time, then yes, you can call another process after that.
Well, can you hear me? This is Stuart.
Sure, we can hear you.
That was the visual workflow?
Correct. Yeah, so have the process builder call the visual workflow and have it reassess. And
that sounds like it. For example, the idea I was thinking of is if we have somebody who has a report due, we want to send a past due a late notice if it hasn't been received. But if the status is received, then we don't want to send that letter, and the status of being received or not, we won't know until the due date.
So with Process Builder and workflows, if there is a filter on that criteria to do that next step, what it's supposed to do, and I have seen bugs in this every once in a while, but for the most part it works. What it's supposed to do is, if during that wait period it no longer fits that that criteria, it bumps it from the queue and it removes it. So you might want to test that to see if you don't have to call another process builder or a visual workflow. It's supposed to remove that from the queue. So if you say, the acknowledgement does not equal acknowledged in 5 days, send an email reminder, create a task. If in those 5 days acknowledged gets triggered to acknowledged from not acknowledged, it is supposed to remove that from the queue and not send that notification or create that task. But I have seen it sometimes bug out and not work 100%.
Thank you.
Nick, since you have an instance open, would you mind showing how you check what's in the queue?
Yeah, definitely. For kind of the two different ways, I'll first showcase the time-based workflow side of items. So if you're building in workflow, and for simple time-based items, I like to use workflows versus process builder, just simply because you can kind of, as Kim alluded to, you can get a little bit more detail as a result of it, and you can actually find the record that we have. And actually, here's the record that we launched at the beginning here. It's still in queue right now. So this is a way to look at that side of it. Let me go over to for the process builder. And actually, I'm trying to remember, is it on the flows page? Yeah, on the flows page, it's the paused and waiting interviews page, or on the right below the flows. And there's some ways to do list views from there as well.
That's great, thank you. I'm keeping half an eye on the time. So what I'd like to, Judith had posed a question about recommending tools to help visualize or prototype a process. And I think there are plenty of you on the call, so I'm going to invite that one as a please post in chat. How do you visualize a process? Because it is actually, the planning part of it is important. So if anyone would like to chat in their favorite tools for visualizing. We'll just quickly look at Christy's question. Nick, if you don't mind.
Oh, sure.
Kim, can you post that to everybody rather than just to me? Thank you.
Yeah,
no problem. So, Christy's question, could you review why do you need to set things to fire 5 minutes later? Is it because you need time to let the rules fire, or do they fire? Why the delay?
Yeah, why the delay? Simply the delay for this case is just because I want it to fire 5 minutes later. I think there's different certain instances. There may be some instances where, in order to have different rules fired different items, we want to wait. For my situation here, it's simply just because I want it to happen 5 minutes after the fact. I've had a couple individuals that have, when we talk to, how do we want acknowledgement to be sent out, or what different things along those lines. We get sometimes caught up on the fact that we can only trigger a workflow on the hour, or I guess not on the hour, but an hour after the rule triggered. And so in order to make that gap less and not have it be immediate is the need that we're trying to solve for here.
And
a good example go ahead.
In one of the demos I'm going to do next, we have an hour delay, and I'm going to be changing it to this because, for instance, when an integrated app comes in and like Click and Pledge or maybe Network for Good, Classy creates an opportunity, there's some stuff going on behind the scenes, especially code-based, that if you run it on that instance, that you're most likely going to get an error with your process builder or flow because the record doesn't technically exist first. So you have to wait a little, like just a matter of seconds to have that work. And default is you have to wait an hour. But with this, now you can say, okay, great, I don't have to wait an hour. I can wait a minute. I can wait 5 minutes, which especially when you're talking about getting email acknowledgements out, you don't want to have that wait an hour before that email gets sent out. You want it as soon as possible. So usually it's because something else is going on in the system and you have to wait for that to happen before you can trigger what you want it to do.
I've come across exactly the same thing, TJ, which is having to wait until Click and Pledge has finished doing everything it needs to do before I can alter a record. So yeah, I came up with exactly the same solution as you. Sorry, Kim, you had a quick example, and then we'll move on to TJ.
Oh yeah, exactly what TJ was saying, but also sometimes just from user entry. So I have a client that someone's entering an account, and we want to make sure that that primary contact is defined, but we may not have created the contact yet because it's a new account, it's a new contact. I want to make sure that happens, but I want to give that user a little bit of time to enter a contact and then go back and define who's the primary or something like that. So you can do something, if I wanted to create a reminder task for them, hey, don't forget this account needs a primary contact defined, I could give them 5 or 10 minutes to make that happen and then start bugging them about it rather than right away on create, and they might get upset because they just haven't had an opportunity to go in and create that contact yet.
That's a great thought too. Fantastic, thank you. Christy will remember your question, and Judith, you'd asked about, as well as the tools, actually how would you plan a process? If you go to the Hub Office Hours group in the Power of Us Hub, the last time that we covered this topic, which was sometime early last year, it's not quite a year ago, but I did post the recording because actually quite a section of the session we talked about planning. We had Ashima Seigel and some other people on the call who are very good at this, and they showed us an example of a really complicated flow and how they'd a complicated process and how they'd figured it out. But also, yes, keep looking at the chat. All right, TJ, sorry, you're not going to get quite 20 minutes, but I'll hand over to you and take it away and tell us a bit more about a process that you've built.
Okay, let me find the right monitor. Okay, am I sharing? Do you see a process builder on the screen?
Absolutely.
Okay, perfect. Sharing the right screen. So what I was thinking of, instead of trying to show one process builder that does a whole bunch of things and is super complex and would take a really long time to explain, I wanted to go through a couple of different, like, quick and easy process builders that do different things to give you guys an idea of what you can use these things for. And then if we have time, I have one that calls a flow that I can show you how those two interact with each other and why call a flow from a process builder and why the process builder just can't do that. in itself. So the first one is they have gifts with their donations, and they want to track an inventory. And we had thought about using products, but instead it was just a simple custom object keeping track of, for this gift, you know, who's getting the gifts, how many of them are they're getting it. But the catch is that for every opportunity, they may get multiple gifts depending on their donation level. So what this is doing is it's saying that when the opportunity is created or edited, take a look at the acknowledged field. If the acknowledged equals true, or if it's been acknowledged and the gift requested contains a pocket calendar, then create a record, a gift receipt record, and it pushes all of these values to that record. It gives you, it hard codes the ID, which is that calendar record, the amount or the value of that donation, the receipt date being the close date. It links the contact so that you can see on the contact records, here's all of the gifts that they have gotten over time. The links to the opportunity, so you can see it both on the gifts record as well as the donation itself. And then they have different types. Is this a membership? Is it sales? Is it a free giveaway? Is it a conference? And because it came in through a donation, it's a membership gift. Now I notice this one has the evaluate next criteria instead of stop. And this, I really love how Salesforce is really committed to Process Builder, that, you know, almost every release they have something new for Process Builder, because just a couple releases ago I couldn't do this in Process Builder. I had to go and do this in Flow. And I believe in October they released an update to Process Builder while I was able to pull it out of Flow and do this all in Process Builder, because now, as I said, they might receive multiple gifts. So if they have a calendar, but they also have a mug, it will create both of these records. And if they also then have the book, Scopes book, then it will also create that record. And it'll just keep evaluating until it finally runs out of records to values to assess, and then it will finally stop. So that's just a really simple evaluates, evaluate on fields, and create associated records that will get tagged to that opportunity. Another one, and this one has this delay that we were talking about with the 1 hour. So the goal of this one is, with Click and Pledge, they wanted to be able to send sustainers an email when they were coming up on their expiration date of their credit card. So if their credit card expired, they wanted to send an email saying, hey, your sustainer membership has expired. If it was a month out from that expiration date, they wanted to send an email, hey, we want to know that your sustainer membership is expiring, update your credit card. And if it was declined with multiple months left to that expiration on the credit card, they wanted to send out an email, your credit card was declined, you know, please re-up. So what this is doing, and there's some formula fields on the transaction record that allows this to do, but basically when a Click and Pledge transaction is created, we have it set to always run because we want this to do it every single time. It's not filter based like the previous Process Builder. It's saying always run when a Click and Pledge transaction is created. And then you'll notice we've got this hour after create. And this is one that I'm going to be going back and creating that time formula so that this will run a little bit sooner. Because if I didn't have this a scheduled action, if I had it immediate, it kicks back an error, because Click and Pledge, as we talked about before, takes a lot of back-end thought process and is updating a whole bunch of records. And upon create, you just have to give it like a minute to let all of that code run and populate and create all of its records. So we've got that scheduled delay so that it won't error out on us. And then we have it updating a stage based on this formula of that says it's declared, it's declined, expiring, oh, it won't let me open it. I have to close. But it grabs the stage and updates the transaction. But what this isn't doing is you don't see anything about the email being sent. And that's because Process Builder cannot send outgoing email alerts. So what this is doing is tagging a field that we can use workflow rules to then send our emails. So this stage is here to trigger a workflow rule. I couldn't have it be a formula because that formula would not trigger a process builder, a workflow rule, anything like that. So I had to manually do something to that record to trigger my workflow rule. So once this stage gets tagged, then my workflow rule fires and says, if my click and pledge transaction recurring stage equals expiring, send my email alerts to the contact with this email template saying, you know, we really want to keep you, we love you as a sustainer, please contact us. And the same thing exists for the expired and the declined. So that is a mix of both Process Builder as well as workflow rules. And the reason why I do Process Builder first and then workflow rules is because of the firing of order of operations. If I had all of this workflow rules, it may try to process this first before the other one. Now I could say reevaluate to make sure that it fires everything again, but that can get kind of messy because you have multiple workflow rules firing over and over and over again. So with this, I knew that this would then trigger the workflow rule instead of having not knowing what order of operations things are firing in. And then the last one I have, and I want to make sure we have time for questions, so I'll stop with this one.
Yeah.
So this one is calling a flow. And so what it's doing is on the contact, whenever it's created, take a look at the source campaign. And if it's populated, call a flow and add this contact to that campaign. So technically, I could create in Process Builder, I could say create a campaign member record from Process Builder. I could do that right here. And the vast majority of the time, that would be fine. But when you're creating records, especially with campaign members, where if that contact is already a member of that campaign, it will error out and it will keep that contact record from being saved because you can't create something where it already exists. And if you're trying to update that campaign member record, if the contact doesn't have that campaign member record, you can't update something that doesn't exist. So what this does is it calls a flow. It says, okay, call this flow that says create update campaign member, send these values from the contact to our flow as variables. Within the flow, campaign ID is going to equal the campaign from our contact. The contact ID is going to equal the contact ID, and the status we're going to hard code to send. And in the flow itself, we're going to start, and it's going to look up based on the campaign ID and contact. Look up to see if you can find a campaign member ID. And if you can't, make it null. And then we really quickly say, does this campaign member exist? If it exists, then that ID that we looked up in that previous step is not blank. If it doesn't exist, let's create that campaign member, and you can set your values with our campaign member or contact ID status. If you have any other fields, you can either hard code them or pull them from your contact. And if it does exist, let's update it. So this is one thing that I have repeatedly come across with Process Builder, where it seems like something that you can do in Process Builder. It's like, oh, let's just create that campaign member. Let's update that campaign member. Let's delete that campaign member. And there are cases where that contact will already have a campaign member, it won't, and it will error out and keep that contact from being saved, which is why you have this flow. And the great thing about this flow, if you keep it amazingly simple like this, and you could also have a delete step in here as well if you wanted it to remove that campaign member. this flow you can now use for other things. I'm actually using this flow in several other process builder. A process builder says, if we have a new contact that has an email that is interested in this topic, add them to this campaign. And it uses the same exact flow. It's just that in the process builder that calls the flow, we might push a different status. The campaign might be a little different. We might hard code the campaign. But that flow is then reusable elsewhere because it's nice and simple, and you just need to push different values from the process builder itself. And I think I'm going to stop and take questions with our like 3.
That's great. Thank you. That's a lot of information in a short space of time. But thank you for racing through all of that, TJ. And I think you made some very important points, particularly about this, the order of the actions, which I think is great, and this whole idea of when do you need to go sort of past just process builder to use a flow. I think. We have, and if you want to know more details about updating the campaign member, look at the chat. I've put a Karen Fitton's blog post on this, which I use a lot. Laurel had a question. She says, I can send an email to a contact using Process Builder. How is that different from being able to send other emails via presumably workflow rules?
So Process Builder, you can't trigger outgoing email messages. You can have tasks and emails to internal folks from Process Builder. If you want to send an email to someone who is not a user in your system, you either have to do it 100% in workflow with an email alert, or have Process Builder update a field that will then trigger that workflow rule. You can send outgoing emails through Flow, Visual Workflow. However, you can't use your email templates. So if you're using Visual Workflow, it's just going to be a straight text email. So if you want your email to be nice and pretty, then you have to use your workflow and email alert, and either have your process builder, your workflow, or something else trigger that workflow rule to send that outgoing email to a contact.
I've had success firing an email template to a non-user, like a contact, through Process Builder, as long as there's an email address to utilize.
That's what it
was.
Anything anyway. If the email, if like you're sending it to the contact itself and your Process Builder is on the contact, then great. If it's another related, like an opportunity, the way around that is to just create a formula field. Although I think that is the
formula fields won't be recognized, but you could do a field update to pull that contact's email down or something to some related. But
that's what it was.
Yeah.
So there are workarounds in that to do it all in one place.
Oh, I see. Okay, so if the email is there, so if you're actually emailing off of the contact record, you're fine. But yeah, if you're dealing with an update on a related record, you have to figure out a workaround. Yeah.
Yeah, you just have to have an email field on that record, and then somehow get it populated with the email address you want to send to. Usually like a field update or something.
Yeah, the email field has to be email type. It can't just be like a text field. It has to be a Salesforce recognized email type.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Yep. Great. Stuart thinks he'll need a video map to describe your demo, TJ. What came first and how and why? We might just have challenged you to a blog post, but I think also you've done some presentations on Process Builder. Is there?
I have, and let me see if I can find. I know I have some screenshots around some of these with step-by-steps of like how and why that I have in the hub. Let me see if I can track those down and post those as well.
Lovely, that would be great. Thank you very much. Okay, Wow. All right. Suddenly we've got through an hour, and as usual with these topics, once we get going, we end up with a huge amount to talk about and feeling like we've run out of time. But we will be respectful of everybody's time. Yes, exactly. It did fly by. So we're at the time. Thank you very much, Nick and Kim and TJ, for all those great ideas and advice that you've shared. Thank you for everybody for listening in, and for those good challenging questions, and also for sharing your comments about planning tools. So please, let's keep the conversation going in the Power of Us Hub, and I'll post this recording when I've sorted it, processed it. A different kind of process. Office Hours will be back same time next Friday. We'll have a general Q&A session with a new panel. In the meantime, thank you again, everybody, for your time and the great questions and advice, and have a lovely weekend.